Well, thank you for coming, and I too would like to thank ISI and everyone who helped coordinate bringing me out here, and also my colleague, Dr. Dabashi. I think what's going to happen now is I'm going to give a kind of a radical take as opposed to what Dr. Dabashi gave. I think he gave something of a philosophical argument which has its place, but to complement that, what I'd like to present is more of a doctrinal argument, which probably will appear very strange to most of you unless you have some kind of grounding in Islam and how Islam has been articulated. And also, one last point, I'm going to be, because Islam does have different branches, I'm specifically going to be talking about Sunni Islam, because Sunni Islam at least accounts for about 85% of the entire Islamic world. Now, the question is, does Islam pose a threat to Western civilization? I am not going to give a straightforward answer, but first I'm going to present some evidence and then hopefully reach a conclusion. I think one of the biggest obstacles for Westerners or non-Muslims in general to understand about Islam is that unlike, and you know, most people living in the West, let's say, are Christians. So I'm going to juxtapose Christianity with it so people can have a better understanding. With Christianity, there's this notion, and a lot of Christians and non-Christians and people who just grew up in a Christian heritage share this notion that religion is a spiritual thing that is not part of the state. And that has precedence in, of course, the Bible and in Jesus' word. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. Now, that has nothing to do with what the church did in history, but at least scripturally, it's always been there. The separation between what man does in the here and now and the spiritual relationship between man and God. Now, from my studies and my understanding of Sunni Islam itself, of course, has a very spiritual component to it. But beyond that, it is an extremely legalistic religion, very much concerned with the here and now. And so if you really go into it, and I'm going to be discussing something of Islamic jurisprudence, or in Arabic what's called usul al-fiqh, which means basically how Muslims go to the corpus of Islamic scripture and writings in order to derive laws to govern their lives, or basically what you've probably heard as called as Sharia law. Now, it turns out that in Sunni Islam, every human act a person can commit in this world, in the here and now, is categorized according to usul al-fiqh, or in short, Sharia law, as being either forbidden, you can't do it, as being discouraged, you can do it, but you shouldn't, as being permissible, and that's the vast majority of human actions that a human can do, they're just permissible, as being recommended, in other words, you don't have to do it, but if you do it, that's all the better, and as being obligatory. Now, everything in Sunni Islam, going back to what's called the four orthodox schools of thought, or in madahib in Arabic, is classified in this way. And they come to these classifications based on the Quran, which is understood to be the verbatim word of God. And the second textual source is the hadith, or the sayings of Muhammad and his deeds and what he did. And so based on that, that's where you get the word Sunni, based on the word Sunnah. Sunnah means the example of the Prophet Muhammad. So Muhammad did X, Y, and Z. That becomes Sunnah for Sunnis, the vast majority of the Islamic world, to try to implement in their lives. Now, I would, Dr. Dabashi was saying at one point that, you know, a lot of people try to portray as Islam as completely evil and the root of all evil, and I would agree with him, and about that a lot of people do that, and I would also agree with him that that is not the case, that Islam is not the root of all evil, and that there are a lot of admirable qualities about Islam. However, going back to our original question, which is the clash of civilizations, you find that when you go back again to the classical usul or roots of jurisprudence in Sharia law, you find that based on the Quran, based on the words of Muhammad, based on the consensus, or what's called ijma' of the ulama, or Islamic scholars and theologians, they came up relatively early on with this concept of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, which means the world was split in two. On the one hand, you have the world of Islam, which is just and good because it's governed by Sharia law. On the other hand, you have the world of infidelity, corruption, and it's called it's the abode of war. In other words, that's the place of war. That's the place the Islamic world is obligated to go fight in order to, and it's seen as an altruistic thing. So Muslims don't think of jihad as excuse me, as a terroristic, evil thing. They see it as an altruistic thing. Infidels are living in the state of jahiliyyah, or ignorance, and they're backwards, and so jihadists are bringing the light of Islam to them, even if it is by the sword, because that's how, if you look at the original biographies of Muhammad, that's how Muhammad did it, and also that's how the first righteous caliphs did it when they conquered essentially all of North Africa and Southwest Asia. So now the concept of jihad, when you look at it and you examine it through Sharia law, you discover that it is actually an obligation. It's an obligation on the Islamic body, no different than, prayer, fasting. The only difference with it is it's what's called in Arabic a fard kifaya, which means it's an obligation on the entire Islamic body that as long as some Muslims are actively upholding it, the rest are exonerated. So not all Muslims have to go on jihad. But so this is what the problem is, from what I understand and the way I see it. To try to dismantle the concept of jihad as military expansion is it will be no less difficult than trying to dismantle things like 5 prayers in Islam. Because again, it's done through a strict methodical way, and the jurists have extrapolated these rules and these worldviews that became codified in Islamic law based on the same methodology. So the same methodology that has made jihad to expand until it essentially governs the entire world, not to force people to become Muslim, but at least until Islam has hegemony over the globe and Sharia is implemented. If you're a Jew or Christian, you can still maintain it and be what's called a dhimmi, which is essentially, in our understanding, a second-class citizen. But so this is ultimately the problem. This is a codified worldview. So now when someone says Osama bin Laden, he's a violent guy, look what he's doing, he's taking things out of context. Well, in certain ways he is, but in certain ways he's not. And you'd be surprised at the way they are able to rationalize their actions based on the Sunnah, the example of Muhammad. So let's look at 9/11, for example. 9/11 was, you got planes crashing, you got innocent women dying, even though there's a lot of hadiths and a lot of jurists who said in Islam, don't kill women, don't kill children, don't do this, don't do that. So how was 9/11 at all being justified through Islam? Al-Qaeda has gone out of its way to actually make what, would appear at least plausible arguments, based again on the way of articulating jihad through Islamic sources and through Sharia. So for example, they'll say that the Prophet Muhammad used catapults when he was invading infidel territories. And these infidel territories, the one I'm thinking of is the town called Ta'if. This was just a town that refused to submit to Islamic rule. And so, according to the biographies, he used catapults. And the scholars have subsequently looked at that fact and said, since Muhammad used catapults, knowing full well that women and children were probably sheltered amongst the infidels, then therefore that becomes a precedent and we can use it. It becomes a sunnah. Now, of course, others will argue with this, but as you can see, Al-Qaeda and radicals, at least as long as they're able to come up with somewhat of a rationalization, it works. Then they also point out to another tradition of Muhammad where a number of mujahids or jihadists come up to him and they want to invade a village. And so they ask him, can we set fire to it at night, set fire to the fortifications? And they ask him explicitly, knowing that women and children are sheltered there. And Muhammad's terse reply is they, women and children, are from among them, from among the infidels. And so they set fire to it. Now, the problem is you'll also find hadiths where Muhammad says, don't do that. And this runs also in the Quran itself. If you look at the Quran, you'll find a lot of tolerant verses, which one that comes to my mind says, Muhammad, or the Quran says, you have your religion, I have mine. And he's speaking to Christians and Jews. And so a lot of Muslims will point to that and say, look, here it is. There's no, and then there's another verse which says there is no coercion in religion, which means I'm a Muslim or should not coerce another person into Islam. Now, the problem with that is in the Quran you also come across a number of violent verses that say the opposite. And a lot of them, one of the most famous one is known actually as in Arabic, Ayat al-Sif, which means the sword verse, which is in Book 9 or Surah Al-Tawbah, verse 5. And this verse, now, and here's the problem. According to the classical jurists, that verse alone abrogated, that is to say, canceled out all of the earlier tolerant verses. Now, a person can come up and say, well, I don't agree with that, and that's all well and good. But if you do that, you are in essence stepping out of the Sunni community because, like I said, there's 4 schools of thought, and all 4 of them agree to A, that jihad is a perpetual state of affairs, is a perpetual state of affairs with the non-Muslim world until they are subsumed. And so that's ultimately the point. So again, what I'm saying is there is a very old legal tradition to what jihad is and to what Islam expects of Muslims vis-a-vis non-Muslims. There's a number of Quranic verses that say, "O you who believe, Muslims, do not take friends and allies from Jews and Christians." Now, if you're a Muslim and you read that, it's going to be very hard for me to understand how do you, as a Muslim, if you're a true, sincere person trying to implement that verse in your life, how do you become, sociable with Jews and Christians, or worse, mushrikeen, who are total pagans, like Hindus and Buddhists? So you have this element involved in Islam, which is very legalistic, very black and white. It says what's right and it says what's wrong. And when it comes to the concept of a clash of civilizations, the notion that Islam must fight not just the West, but the rest of the world is doctrinally demonstrable and historically demonstrable. Let's not forget that Islam first Arabia was conquered. Arabia was not intrinsically Muslim. It was conquered. And after Muhammad died, there was a full year of warfare because a lot of the tribes that did convert broke off from Islam. And the first Caliph, Abu Bakr, waged a bloody war where tens of thousands of people died. And then after that, it spread to Egypt and to Syria and to Persia and throughout all North Africa until Spain and all the way to essentially India. Now that was all, if you look and read the historical documents written by Muslims, they all describe it as conquest. And again, they justify it by what I've been saying, that this is what we must do. And again, if you continue looking at it, you find this thing went on all the way until, the Ottoman Empire started invading Eastern Europe and the Balkans, conquering it. And then I think what happened and why this is very difficult for people to understand today in the West, whereas a few generations ago or centuries ago, non-Muslims would have no problem with this argument, is that we've kind of lost track of history. And so we look back, if you were born in this era or whatever and you live here, you look at the Muslim world and you don't see violence. You don't see Muslims screaming jihad, let's kill the world. But you have to ask yourself, is that because they have completely dismantled the concept of jihad and therefore they've thrown it overboard and it no longer matters? Or is it because they're in a state right now where they are incapable? Can the Islamic world, even if it wanted to, wage a jihad against the rest of the world and conquer it? No, it can't. And even legally it can't do it because it doesn't have a caliphate and doesn't have an imam. So I think we in the West are suffering from an epistemological problem understanding this, this legalistic aspect, not least, again, because lots of people in the West come from a Christian heritage and they can't begin to comprehend a religion that is so fixated in black and white terms and not about a spiritual thing. So in the West, someone will say, well, I'm a Methodist, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, I'm this. I believe this, I interpret it this way. I'm not saying that doesn't exist in Islam, but if you're going to be a standard Sunni who belongs to one of the schools of jurisprudence, you can't simply discount 1,400 years of tradition and an articulation of Islamic doctrine and theology. And one last point is I don't discount the whole concept that poverty I do believe that there's a lot of grievances involved in the Islamic world and that poverty helps create discontent and frustration, and that a lot of people may end up articulating it through an Islamic paradigm. But one of the questions that occurs to me is if you look at the whole world, it's not just the Islamic world that is impoverished, and it's not just the Islamic world that is living under dictatorial regimes. And yet, so that's to me always been a question. In other words, I haven't heard of a Cuban driving a truck laden with dynamite into a Cuban building saying Jesus is great. And I haven't, so again, it seems to me there's precedence in the theology to lead to this sort of thing, to jihad. And ultimately, because it is a doctrinal thing, it's not something open to dispute. If you say, I'm not going to do this, that's tantamount to saying, I'm not following the words of God. That causes a problem as opposed to it just